Thank you so much for coming this evening. We've had a really exciting day filled with AI and the future of society, and we're capping it all off this evening with a public lecture. So we've got Professor Genevieve Liveley here today. She's a professor of classics, and how does a professor of classics end up working in AI? We'll find out. She's been doing it for some time now. She's a Turing Fellow. That's the Institute for Data Science and AI, the National Institute. She's Director of Research Institute for Socio-Technical Cybersecurity. And she's been a long-time collaborator of the JGI, Gene Golding Institute. And she's worked on research narratives of tech and risk, with focus on cyber and AI. She's founded the Futures Literacy Through Narrative Institute. That's enough from me. Without further ado, please.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks to Dan, and thanks to you for coming out on a sunny evening. It's not necessarily the right time to come in inside. There was wine, which is often a very nice pull and very good food. So thank you, JGI, for taking care of us so well. But really, thank you for coming out. It's an hour and a bit out of anyone's evening is not nothing. So I thought it would be helpful, before we kick off, to just give you a bit of an origin story to answer Dan's question. How does a professor of classics end up swimming around the shark-infested custard that is contemporary research in AI? And I know that Bristol, we like to do things a little bit differently here. And I think I'm part of that bigger story. But I thought it would be, this feels a bit narcissistic, but I'll just give a couple of minutes to give you that backstory. I am a Frankenstein creature. My PhD, which feels like 100 years ago, looked at narrative dynamics of ancient epic. It was a strongly feminist work. And then I discovered chaos theory and chaotics in my second year. And my PhD supervisor, I think, cried a little bit and said, no, we can probably make that work. Oh, go away. And so I tried to use some of the mathematic principles of chaotics to order disorder and to disorder order within ancient narrative poetics. And one of the case studies, so far so good, I'm a happy little narratologist swimming around in classics world. One of my case studies happened to be Ovid's Pygmalion story. And there's a little sidebar here, a sort of a cameo appearance by friend and longtime collaborator Kate Devlin, who was doing her PhD at the same time as me. And we were sharing a flat together, and talk turned to sex robots, as it does, of an evening. And so I ended up working with Kate on sex robots for a few years, not least of all because I discovered that the sex robots conferences had funding for wine, and the classics and the narrative conferences, not so much. We got tea and rich tea biscuits. So I enjoyed the sex robots work for a while. We tried to buy one once for the purposes of research. We weren't going to give them, our credit card details, but that was fun until it wasn't. You just got a bit icky, frankly, after a while. There were only so many, disembodied heads and sort of grotesquely, dismembered sort of female body parts that you can look on a daily basis. So I jacked that in. I still get invited to conferences occasionally and do the odd bit with Kate. But I really moved that into thinking more deeply about the narrative history, about robots more generally, cyborgs. There are lots of cyborgs in the ancient world, in ancient narratives anyway. And what really interested me beyond that sort of embodiment was the artificial minds, the AI, that was giving life and spirit and story to these creatures. So that led to me doing various work on AI. And it really is, I think, testament to the intellectual generosity of colleagues here in Bristol and at the Turing Institute, that they said, all right, let's have a conversation with this weird classicist. There's something interesting here. And I've worked really hard and I've read a lot, and going to events like this just keep my brain engaged. It's hard work, but you get those lovely dopamine hits from doing interdisciplinary work. Another side, any story has a moment of peripeteia, a turning point. And I think I was just absolutely fortunate that 2018 saw the bicentenary of Shelley's Frankenstein. And so there was a lot of work being done, a lot of global conferences around the Frankenstein. And Frankenstein, if you remember your sort of, I was saying modern classics, 19th century, not quite modern. In my world, it counts as modern. But Mary Shelley was a great classicist, as were the Romantic circle around her. So Frankenstein is the product of bits and pieces of the classics, of his Pygmalion being just one of them. So lots of work around that. And somehow there were people there working on emerging technologies and features, more AI, and I like to collaborate with good eggs. There were lots of good eggs in this world, and this is why I'm still working on emerging technologies, futures, imaginaries, and the good stuff around AI. So that's a really quick origin story. I hope you are happy with that little minor excursus. It was also an excuse. It wasn't just me being a narcissist. Remember, Pygmalion, not Narcissus. But I wanted to squeeze a little bit of Frankenstein in, and I couldn't actually find a good spot for it in the rest of this evening's talk. But Frankenstein is pivotal, not just in the little sort of backstory I've given you about my sort of journey here, but Frankenstein sort of galvanizes the stories that come out of the ancient world and sets a new agenda for thinking about artificial minds, artificial intelligences, and what it means for man to create other human creatures with which he, obviously in this case, sometimes she, might interact. And I love this frontispiece from the 1818 first edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So this is the moment at which Victor, who's running out the door as fast as he can, because he's just realised how ghastly his creation is. What I really like about this image is how it captures the backstories. Look at the bookshelf in the background there. All those texts, all those stories, all those books that have kind of gone through Victor into his creature. They've programmed his thinking and they've programmed his creature. Down here, we have Victor's own notebook, which the creature is happily going to take with him as he goes out to live in the woods. And at some point, he's going to learn to read, and he's going to, in a sense, learn how to become human by reading stories, including stories from the classics. And he's going to, his turning point, the creature's peripeteia, is reading that book down there, Victor's notebooks, when he realizes, the horror with which his creator perceived him. So a bit of an opportunity to shoehorn in some Shelley, and so you understand how I got here beyond just walking down the hill. So let us, there's going to be a few bad puns. I'm not going to apologize in advance. It's how I roll. The key thing then about that Frankenstein sort of motif is it reminds us that we've been telling stories about artificial minds, machines, intelligent machines, humanoid creatures for a really long time. We might have only coined the formulation artificial intelligence, AI, in the last century, but we've been telling stories for literally thousands of years. Now, some 3,000 years ago, we find ancient epic from the Greek tradition telling stories about autonomous machines. I'm going to show you some examples. AI companions and carers, cyborg warriors, military background and research are there, and fembots programmed to chat and seduce and explicitly designed to punish mankind. This sounds like fiction, right? This sounds like a science fiction in itself. This is all science fact. The fact is that they were telling stories, by the way, not that these things existed. I'm going to show you some specific examples. I start with one that almost didn't make the cut. So this, because it's not very sexy, primarily. It's not super exciting, but it's from the Greek poet Homer, from his great epic Iliad. And it's not very sexy, as I say. It's a little bit sort of mundane. It's essentially, it's a glorified hostess trolley, if any of you remember what they are. Excellent. Some of you know some nods of recognition. It looks as this is an archaeological, find. It's a reconstruction. It's the British Library, actually, I think, have this one. But there are examples of these going back to the 12th century BCE. The story that I've put on the screen actually comes from probably about the 9th and gets written down in the 8th. Now, I hesitated to include this because it's basically an imaginary robot rather than an intelligent machine per se. And I really wanted to restrict my examples this evening to representations and imaginings of artificial minds. I really wanted to kind of focus on that AI aspect. There are tons of robots and automata, cyborgs doing other random things in antiquity. So I really wanted to focus on the artificial minds. Now, these tripods, that's what they are. I know they've got 4 wheels. Don't get me started. But that's what they're called, these tripods. I think they are interesting from an AI point of view, not least of all because this is the first time in the Western canon that something gets referred to as automatoids. The first time we find that word being used. And it gets used one other time in Homeric epic, and it's to describe a character, Menelaus. He's Agamemnon's sort of younger, dumber brother, if you know your Greek epic, which I know that you do. And Menelaus, he's a bit of a puppet, and the gods, make him do things, and his brother makes him do things. And it's one moment when Menelaus kind of grows a pair and has an idea of his own. And he's described as automatoi in the same context. So we get these machines and we get this sort of puppet character being described using this really interesting term. But as I say, didn't really obviously make the cut for me, but I put it in because I think it's interesting, because Homer doesn't tell us any more about how he might imagine the mind model or the mental state of this particular machine might work. It's just a little kind of detail. But I have put this in. What tipped me over this afternoon, I decided to put it in, was they've got clever handles. They've got clever ears. I am stretching the point. I will. Can you see these things up here? They've got clever handles, clever ears. And he sends them into other people's houses, other gods' houses, I should say, because he lives on his own. He's not part of the main the main gang on the campus on Olympus. And he sends them out to the houses of the other gods, and they come back of themselves. And yet I've spent too long working in cybersecurity, I suspect. But I can't help but think there's something spy-y going on with these. But I'll get back to you on quite what that might be. Now, that is a bit dull, I grant you. Don't worry, I've got better stuff. Stick with me. No, wrong computer. Right. These are very, very cool indeed. These are autonomous vehicles. From in 9th century BCE, that's 3,000 years, autonomous vehicles. How cool is that? Very cool. That was a rhetorical question. They're very cool indeed. These are properly autonomous machines. No two ways about it. These, we've just got a picture of the one, but the way that Homer writes about them, this is in the Odyssey this time, not the Iliad. But he's talking about a fleet of them, but we just see one in action. And this little description here, it's part of a much bigger narrative, describes King Alcinous, we're going to come back to his name in a moment, essentially asking Odysseus, give me your precise coordinates, dear friend, on the island of Ithaca, from whence you come, so that I can put them in the sat-nav, and the ship will take you home. No fear of shipwrecks, it'll avoid Charybdis, all the rocks, you're fine, I will get you home. Remember, at this point, poor old Odysseus has been bouncing around the Mediterranean from island to island for the last 11 years. And the ships do indeed get him safely home after they've been programmed. There's another nice little detail in the longer narrative here. King Alcinous chooses for Odysseus a ship that's about to go on its maiden voyage. Its sort of mind is completely clear. There's no risk of it taking him somewhere he doesn't want to go, because that's what the last passenger had programmed in. It's a really nuanced, fascinating account of imagining an autonomous vehicle. Let me just circle back to Alcinous. I don't know what your Greek is like, but Alcinous is not just a random name. Alcinous, I know there are some classists in the room, so Alcinous means strong mind or deep mind. I'm really not making this up. King Alcinous is known for his nous, for his nous, for the strength of his mind. It's appropriate that he should have an intelligent machine of this kind. As part of the bigger narrative, he also is supposed to have sort of robotic guard dogs. I should point out that he is mortal, so he's not a divine creature. This is Alcinous, like Odysseus, but he is special, special in so many ways. But he occupies this sort of utopian island of Phaeacia, where magical, special things happen. Hence, the power that he has to have these autonomous vehicles. This is weird, and this is wonderful, I think, as an example of an autonomous vehicle from antiquity. What I also find really striking, and I want to just kind of flag for you, Homer takes great pains to reiterate that these are intelligent, they have minds. He doesn't need to bang on quite so much about their smartness. These ships can take you home plotting the course in their minds. That's fine. The ships themselves, they know the thoughts and the minds of men, and they know every city. Homer really labours the point that these ships have a degree of intelligence. The Greek here suggests that they have a particular kind of intelligence. They have phrenes, so they have minds, but they don't have thoughts. I'm splitting hairs a little bit here. The thoughts of men get put in them, and then they do what they're told to do. They follow that programming, but they themselves don't originate thoughts. It's just a really interesting, I think, aspect of what's going on with the kind of mind model that Homer is trying to work through when he's imagining what it might be like for a machine, for an object to have a mind, to have intelligence. But the crucial thing, I think, that big take home is look how many times he draws our attention to the intelligence of these creatures. Not really creatures, these machines, I think. I'm going to stick with that. We have creatures coming up next. I'm going up in order of coolness, I think. Next up, we have some embodied AI. We have some fembots, I guess is an appropriate word, but it's a bit more exciting than the ships and the tripods and the robot dogs. These are Hephaestus's golden slave girls, or amphipoloi. And they are made by Hephaestus. He's the blacksmith, in this case, goldsmith, I guess, god. They're his slaves, and they're imagined as kind of sentient carers or companions. And again, Homer really emphasizes, and he need not do this. This is, I think this is a really interesting choice. He emphasizes that they have intelligence in their minds, as well as speech, as well as strength, and they know how to work. This isn't just a kind of casual throwaway. They have intelligence. We don't get to see much of them in action. He puts one set of tools away in the forge. He moves that into, to the back of the shop, as it were, and out come these amphipoloi. They help him wash. They help him get dressed. And it's, I think, an interesting sort of footnote to this, that Hephaestus is the famous disabled god. He has a limp, and these amphipoloi come out to support him. They're very much playing that carer role, this companion role. There's also a hint in the broader narrative that they are to be imagined as overtly kind of sexualized. They're certainly gendered. They look just like real girls. They look just like living girls. And I've given you an example of this vase. This isn't of the amphipoloi. This is just of typical slaves in this period. Actually, the post-Homeric period. But I think there is something significant in the backstory, I think, to Hephaestus's creation and engagement with his amphipoloi. Those of you who remember your Greek myth will know that they are sort of symbolically standing in for the other woman in Hephaestus's life. Hephaestus is married to Aphrodite, who does not care to spend too much time at the back of the shop, away from her friends. She's kind of shagging her way around the rest of the mortal and immortal world. So there's a sense in which they are sort of structurally standing in for that figure. Don't know what that gesture is meant to say, but you take my point. So I think something is really interesting going on with these amphipoloi and the very first gendered feminine examples of intelligent creatures that we have in the Greek tradition. This is back in the Iliad. What else have we got? I think wrong computer again. The most famous, I think, artificial creation of artificial intelligence, antiquities, got to be Pandora. Again, do you spot the pattern? Hephaestus is making her. He looks like he's about to hit her with a hammer. This is not. This is part of the active creation here. This is from a much longer narrative section, and I couldn't work out what to cut out because all of it is so good. So I've done my best. And I just want your attention to that being the father of men and gods laughed aloud. This is Jupiter, this is Zeus. And he's laughing aloud because he's come up with a really cunning ruse, a very cruel, jolly jape, to punish Prometheus and the race of men for the theft of fire. So Prometheus has stolen fire. He's stolen technology. He's stolen knowledge from the gods. And he's got to pay. And Pandora is the trade-off. So Hephaestus is called in to wreak Jupiter, Zeus's Rowenge. This comes not from Homer, but from his kind of broad contemporary, the poet Hesiod. And like those Homeric amphipoloi, Pandora is really interesting for lots of reasons, but she's very, very similar to those amphipoloi. She's got human intelligence put into her. She's got speech. She's got strength. This seems to be important, the strength, to help around the home. And then thanks explicitly to Aphrodite in this context, she's got sexiness, she's got charm, she's got karate, she has the power of persuasion. I also like the fact that Zeus orders Athena to teach her needlework and weaving. This is the most important, frankly, the only skill that you need as a woman in the ancient world. But she doesn't just put it into her like all the other attributes. She teaches her. This machine, this AI is capable of learning. Obviously, I'm going to lean on that a little bit in the context of kind of machine learning in the 21st century. What else is interesting? I think the fact that this is designed to be a punishment, she's designed to be the trade-off for fire, makes her really interesting. In some of the research we do, we refer to her as a technosoma. She embodies technology, and she replaces the fire that Prometheus has stolen from the gods. She is not a happy creature. We've seen the amphipoloi sort of very simply coming out to help. But this creature is full of lies, crafty words, and deceit. And that seems significant because she's going to herald in a new dystopian age. Her job is to punish, not to kill, but to punish, to make life a living misery. There's one more note that I was going to pull out here. We often see Hephaestus as a sort of lone creator character in ancient narratives around artificial intelligence. What I like about here is it's clearly a team effort. The programming of Pandora is not the traditional lone creator, master, think, Elon Musk-y type. It's a team effort. Everyone's putting in a little bit in here, which I think is, much closer to kind of real-world AI research and programming. But those tropes that we saw with the amphipoloi absolutely scream through here. She's designed by a single creator. There's this shadowy male figure in the background, but she's highly sexualized, thanks to Aphrodite, if nothing else. And she's so beautiful, she's goddess-like. She transcends the living girl, real girl model that we saw in the others. I've got one more for you before I start to kind of cash out what this means and why this is interesting. This is arguably my favorite artificial intelligence from the ancient world. This is Talos. Isn't he gorgeous? He's this embodied, very hyper-masculine artificial intelligence. Again, stories circulate from as early as the 8th and 9th century. This is, I think, a 5th century vase, and he gets written about in Apollonius's sort of story of Jason and the Argonauts. You've probably seen him in the kind of Harryhausen movies, where he's not nearly as beautiful as he appears here. He's a bronze warrior. Think Terminator. I mean, this is a proto-Terminator character. He's usually portrayed as what I think is, a little bit of sort of it's a little bit Arnie casting, really, as a sort of Chucky monster. So he stands on the cliffs of Crete and he throws rocks down at Jason and the Argonauts, to get them to go away. But in the most famous and I think interesting and nuanced narrative surviving about him, his artificial mind really comes to the fore. He's not just that rock-chucking monster. His artificial mind is hacked by Medea. I also love the fact that the first account we have of a hacker, for want of a better word, is a young girl. She's not wearing a hoodie, but she is wearing a veil, who essentially, in some versions, she seduces him and makes him fall in love with her. He realizes he's mortal and he stumbles and falls. Or in other versions, she gives him hope of mortality, not immortality, incidentally. And then once he's got this idea of, I could be a real boy too, it's a really interesting sort of Pinocchio-type story in the subtext here. He realizes that he's vulnerable. He might be made of metal, but he's vulnerable too. That thought makes him fall, and he dies just like any other epic hero. He's really, therefore, I think, the first in a long line of sort of empathetic AI who realise at the last they're more human than some of the humans around them. That kind of classic trope. I don't know if you can see from here, but on the vase painting, some of you don't buy this, I know, I've tried to before. He looks like he's crying. It's not a crack. I've looked very carefully. It's not a crack in the paint. I think the Talos vase painter might have tried to humanise him even more and give him a little tear, which might be symbolic of, the ichor flooding out of his Achilles heel ankle, but clearly an empathetic, sympathetic robot figure here, also just gorgeously depicted. Right. Big question then, after that excursus into the ancient world in 3,000 years, what's the big so what here, right? Why should we care about this? Why do I think it's interesting? Well, we're still telling essentially the same stories about AI. You will have recognized in those tales that we just, really skipped through. The tropes, figures, characters, story plot lines in a lot of Hollywood, TV, and sci-fi novels. This should trouble us, I think. Ancient Greece may be the cradle of civilization, but its values and its ethics do not translate well into the 21st century. This is a place where it's great to be a man, it's great to be healthy, rich, educated, a full citizen. Great if you're one of those. If you're anything else, anything less than that, and I use the term less specifically, I think it really sucks. To be anything else is to be less than human, potentially sort of non-human. This is a society with slaves, a culture where women and children could be traded like those tripods that we saw in one of the earlier slides. This doesn't represent any values I think we would want to cherish in the 21st century. I think it should, and it does, sort of trouble a lot of us that we're seeing their same characters, their same tropes, the same storylines repeating across those 3,000 years of science fiction and its representations of artificial intelligences. Let's just skip through a little recap of what they involve. Those autonomous machines and vehicles, those AI companions and carers, those hyper-masculine AI warriors, same token, hyper-feminine, hyper-sexualized AI fembots and chattybots, the hubristic lone male creator, with that one exception when the whole team get involved, the killer AI, the destructive AI, being used to kind of reflect on immortality, humanity, slavery, and power, particularly in those later versions. So the Talos story, Apollonius really starts to make us ask questions about what it means to be human. In this context, that means what it means to be a citizen male, but hey-ho. And we also see examples of empathetic AI. Classically, of course, it's really, really significant that all of these AI, with the exception of those machines, are embodied. No sense of distributed systems. We really wouldn't expect that, I think, in this period. But those tropes absolutely repeat across the last 3,000 years with one dominant narrative pattern, that dystopian imaginary. Now, I tried really hard in preparation for tonight to come up with some modern utopian imaginaries. So remember that the ship, the Phaeacian ship, is part of a sort of utopian space. The Phaeacians, they live in fairyland. It's a gorgeous utopian space. Nobody works. Well, someone tends to the crops. They live in peace. They have plenty. The weather is like Goldilocks weather. It's not too hot. It's not too cold. It's a lovely, lovely space if you happen to be, one of the elite living there. It's the big rock candy mountain with AI, basically. But this is what I came up with when I tried to do a similar search through the corpus of 20th and 21st century. You know where this is going. Stories of utopian imaginaries involving AI, embodied or otherwise. And I think there's a reason why I came up with nothing here, that nothing works as kind of truly utopian. From a storytelling perspective, utopias are really boring, okay? They are really that dull. If you've watched The Good Place, the TV show, you know that works narratologically, because I'm trying not to give any spoilers this evening, but watch it if you haven't and you will understand. From a narrative point of view, utopias are really, really boring because nothing happens. Because if a utopia is a perfect space, for anything to change, you're going to make it 1 degree less perfect. So utopias are kind of static situations, and story is all about change. It's all about what narratologists like me like to call eventfulness. Utopias have no eventfulness. They're just dull. No good at all for storytelling purposes. Hence the blank screen, just to convey that dullness, that nothing happening. Now, I could, of course, have given you some media stories, some news stories. I could have shared with you any one of Elon Musk's recent utopian narratives about the future of AI. He pumps this stuff out regularly. But I decided I didn't want to give him space on my screen. We can come back to this in the question time, but that is why you've got a blank screen, because it was that or Musk, and I decided to go with that. I hope that's all right. But that was editorial decision. We can discuss. I obviously had much more fun trying to come up with examples of dystopian imaginaries. In fact, I had far too many to sit on a single slide. So these are just my favourite examples. I hope you see something you recognise here. And I'm sure you've got tons of other really gorgeous ones that didn't make my final cut here. But these dystopian imaginaries absolutely dominate film, TV, sci-fi novels. We've got lots of autonomous machines, autonomous vehicles. We've got lots of hypermasculine AI warrior types. We've got lots of hubristic lone male creators. We've got destructive, depressed, lonely, bored killer AI. This really is, I think, the 20th, 21st century cultural imaginary around AI. This is the prevalent plot line, isn't it? Same goes for hyper-sexualized, kind of feminine bots. I love how Fritz Lang's Metropolis is sort of reworking some of the imaginary from Homer's Golden Amphipoloi, by the way. Really easy to find these kind of hyper-sexualized kind of tropes, the fembots and the chatbots, these embodied AI characters, whether primary or secondary. But a little sort of, sidebar, these are also primarily dystopian. I did try, I promise. It gets pretty much, repeated again, even when we're looking at those stories where the AI are empathetic, sympathetic characters, when they're companions or carers. The narrative world in which we encounter these are either bleak or a little bit heartbreaking. However cute you might think WALL-E is, his story world is basically a post-apocalyptic tip, right? I mean, it's not a nice place. It's clearly a dystopian story world environment. Have I got this on here? Yes, Short Circuit. Johnny Five is charming, right? I suspect quite racist, having rewatched this recently, but potentially charming. But Johnny Five is basically Frankenstein rewritten. He's even animated by a lightning bolt, which is why I've put him next to Mary Shelley's novel. And then Megan is really, 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 really scary Pandora. I think it's really not a nice film. I'm a little bit traumatized, you see. Some of you might want to take issue, again, we can come back to this in the conversation, why I've put Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in my companion Kara AI slide. But I really think, doing some work on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein recently for an AI and literature book, I'm pretty sure that Frankenstein is just a bleak bromance. And we can discuss later, but I think it works. Victor just wants a friend, and Frankenstein's creature just wants someone to love him. So I thought it qualified here, but I also wanted to highlight that bit about Johnny Five. All right then. We can come back to this if needs be. But again, really quite depressing, quite sad, even when they are sort of trying to be heartwarming. Let me double down on the question that I threw at you earlier. Why does this matter? Why should we care if story patterns from 3,000 years ago replicate across our modern stories about AI? After all, these stories are obviously science fiction. They're not science fact. Why take them seriously? Why invest time and energy thinking about them and analysing them in the way that we do? Why should we take them seriously? I want to give you some examples now. I can turn into the second act of tonight's talk. And this is just to highlight why I think we need to take this seriously. And think about the real world ramifications and consequences of these ancient representations. So in 2018, the House of Lords published this Select Committee report on artificial intelligence, and it's golden. It really is great. It's available online if you are so minded. You can take a look yourself. There won't be a test or anything, but if you want to kind of have a little play around, I've pulled out what I think are a couple of the most kind of salient and juicy examples. Let me read you paragraph 39 in my best House of Lords voice. All right. The representation, I'm not going to do that to you, I promise. The representation of artificial intelligence in popular culture is light years away from the often more complex, I think always more complex and mundane reality. Based on representations in popular culture and the media, the non-specialist would be forgiven for picturing AI as a humanoid robot with or without murderous intentions, or at the very least, highly intelligent, disembodied voice able to assist seamlessly with a range of tasks. I wonder what they've got in mind there, right? So this is in the House of Lords Select Committee's report. Gets better. Expanding their sort of definition of story to think at news story. Journalists covering AI informed us. They did a really robust piece of research. I know that some of us in the room contributed to this work. Journalists covering AI informed us that it was often difficult to cover AI and automation issues in a responsible and balanced manner, given the current level of public interest in the subject. Is that somehow the public's fault? I don't know. I feel a little casting of shame there. Sarah O'Connor. That's Sarah O'Connor, not Sarah Connor. Employment correspondent for the Financial Times, unless it's a ruse, told us if you ever write an article that has robots or artificial intelligence in the headline, you're guaranteed it'll have twice as many people click on it. AI, robots, embodied AI, clickbait. Journalists were sensationalizing the subject in order to drive web traffic and advertising revenues. We all kind of knew this, right? But it's nice that it's I think, speaking to the powers that need to be hearing this. I really suggest if you're bored and you want to have a look, go and play through this document. There's more. This is from the Royal Society. Again, a number of us in the room contributed to the work that fed into this report. This came out, I think, 2018, 2019. Looked at, again, the way that narratives around AI were influencing real-world decisions, real-world research, and investigating what potential harms that might be accruing there. And the society concluded, just like the House of Commons report, the AI narratives are distorted and dystopian. They don't represent reality in any meaningful way. But what I find slightly strange, and this was not part of the conversations I had with them in the workshops I attended, they thought that there might be some good in this. Just see what you think of this. I think the summary, my take home from this section of the report, is that basically, if the public is scared of AI, then that's a good thing, potentially, because maybe that means that the governments globally and the tech companies globally will work really hard to make sure that their products and their services are safe and ethical and responsible. Exactly. I don't think they were right. I'm going to go on record and say I don't think they were right about that. Actually, the lack of governance, the kind of lack of anticipatory governance in particular, the lack of regulation still continues to make me grind my teeth in an unhealthy way. And the lack of care and attention to safety in recent years, frankly, seems a pretty dystopian framing to me. Another couple of headlines from reports to kind of give you a sense of how people have been taking this problem seriously about the way we tell stories about AI damaging the AI ecosystem. This is a research paper which carried out some really lovely work with AI researchers, so a sort of bit of like meta-analysis. But it's also quite chipper, I thought, and perhaps sort of misplacedly so, about the role of science fiction in shaping public perceptions of AI, especially in the context of science communication, where you can, obviously imagine that using stories in this way is helpful and illuminating, and where AI researchers might want to appeal to familiar AI stories and characters as a way of communicating the work that they're doing when they're talking to funders, when they're talking to policymakers or the public. And the first quote here, I think, highlights some of the potential issues of concern that I certainly have with this, though. So a problem, this is from an AI researcher, a problem of the conversational chatbot interface on which they're working is that they don't have a HAL 9000 level of intelligence. And there's ambiguity in how the computer interprets what the human is trying to convey. Now, is that supposed to be a good thing or a bad thing that the chatbot doesn't have HAL 9000 levels of intelligence? I think that's probably a good thing. I remember 2001, not the year, the film. Clearly, the real problem here is that users expect a much higher degree of sophistication and indeed sentience in their sort of AI interface than that they're going to get through these kind of platforms. They've been sort of primed to expect degrees of sophistication from the movies and the sci-fi novels that they're engaging that just doesn't translate across into reality. Again, I think we knew this was the case. We're really some way away from HAL. And I'm happy with that. Yes. And the subtext in the second quote, I also find a little, a little disturbing is probably too strong. Interesting, by which I mean kind of concerning. So science fiction representations of AI, such as HAL or Commander Data, are the initial inspiration for many researchers entering the field. Well, that's nice. You can see how you watch a film, you read a novel, I want to do that when I grow up. But really? Data and HAL? And it just concerns me that the AI research and researchers of the future should be sort of valorizing these positions from the 60s and 70s. How are we going to ensure a broad range of people entering this research as a field, as a profession? How are we going to move away from trying to move into the future and make it represent the past? That's my sort of anxiety around that dynamic. How do we get diversity, not just in the breadth of people entering the field, but in the work that they're undertaking and the imaginations that they bring to that work, because that's absolutely critical here. I've got one more quotation from this report. It's, again, online, open access, it's really good. Sci-fi film is thought of as a mechanism that promotes technological awareness in society, warming them being us, the public society, of the perils of artificial intelligence. Okay, that's legit, I guess, but what about the benefits? Who's out there informing the public, that's us lot, of the benefits, the potential benefits and goods of AI, if the dystopian imaginaries that we've seen are the predominant ones? So the House of Lords report, that Royal Society report, and this academic study are all agreeing that for good or ill, like it or not, science fiction is already having real-world consequences. And one of the prime examples of this, which I'm just going to have a little brief excursus about, and which these reports oddly, I think, predominantly overlook, is the way in which certain sci-fi tropes and stories have become established as if they were real-world paradigms, real-world rules, real-world laws, science fiction transformed into fact. I'm sure you're ahead of me here. Classic example, Asimov's fictional 3 laws, 4 laws if you count the rest, they're part of fiction. They're part of the story universe, story world that Asimov ingeniously creates. But the UN hasn't signed up to the 3 laws of robotics. You know, they're not something you agree to abide by when you fill in your university research ethics applications. They're not a real thing. But they have had a profound real-world effect on the way we think about what responsible research looks like in AI, on responsible, ethical, technical innovation, not just in robotics, but in AI as well. But just to remind you, these are fictional laws. They're not a real thing. I also take issue with, I love Asimov, by the way. I'm not dissing Asimov here. I'm not dissing Asimov here, just the way that the fictions get concretized in the real world. Asimov refers to something in his fiction as a fictional motif, something refers to as the Frankenstein complex. He's so awesome. Which supposedly explains mankind's gut fears that any artificial man they created would turn upon its creator. That's my best Asimov. And of course, the complex that draws, this notional complex draws on Mary Shelley's Gothic novel of the same name. And again, it's not a thing. It's a lovely way of explaining how some characters, sorry, I said I was going to go off on a couple of rants tonight. But it's just not a real thing. I'm going to throw my own field under the bus a little bit. This is why I get exercised about this, because I spend a lot of time working with cognitive narratologists. And in this part of narratology, we're kind of trying to work out how stories program humans, yeah, how they sort of get into our phrenes and our thoughts and make us think and behave and act in certain ways, and how writers, you know, can manipulate audiences using certain kind of story motifs and story tropes. Cognitive narratologists love Asimov, and they particularly love the Frankenstein complex. And they treat it as if it was, a real sort of adaptation of the human brain, that we've evolved really slowly, and we're very easily confused, which may or may not be true, by things that are natural but look unnatural, or natural and look unnatural. The idea is that, you know, we've evolved really slowly, and we're really thick when it comes to telling differences, which is why, you know, so anthropomorphic AI really confuses us. And they play out this idea that we are sort of somehow human brains are programmed, have evolved to be troubled by this, and we resolve that anxiety by telling ourselves stories whereby the creature that is artificial but looks natural turns against its creator. Absolute nonsense in so many ways. This isn't an evolved adaptation. The claim that the narratologists make in this field is that this Frankenstein complex, not a thing, is trans-historical, universal. Every culture that tells stories, we're the storytelling animal, has this Frankenstein complex. No research, because it's not true, because it's not a thing. Just think back to the stories that I shared with you from the ancient world. None of those embodied AI go rogue. None of them turn against the creator. They might be a bit killy, and they might contribute to a dystopian environment, but they are doing what they're programmed to do. They never go rogue. They never turn rebellious. So the rebellious robot, the Frankenstein complex, is not the universal, trans-historical thing that some of my colleagues will tell you it is. It's a fiction. It's a great fiction, works really well in Asimov, worked really well in Frankenstein. I could rant about this all afternoon. I won't, because I've got a few concluding thoughts to wrap up with. And then we can have a conversation about this. This imbrication between fiction and fact in thinking about AI is just inextricable. This is why I'm doing this with my pause. And I think this is really why we need to question the stereotypes, the tropes, and the patterns that are so deeply embedded, like some kind of buggy code drawing from the sort of software library in the AI stories that we tell ourselves. Now, one way to do this is by honing a skill that we have as individuals, but also I think as a society, as a culture, and that's our narrative literacy. And this is something that in the policy context, Sarah Dillon and Claire Craig have been describing as story listening. So narrative literacy, story listening. I'm going to give you an example of what that means rather than trying to break it down. You are in possession of narrative literacy if, when you watch the Terminator franchise, you know that the real baddie, the real threat, is not the Terminator, it's Skynet, right? That is narrative literacy. That is proper, good story listening. You've got narrative literacy if you noticed when we looked at the Pandora story that the real threat to humankind, the real plague upon men who eat bread, isn't Pandora, it's Zeus, who's kind of chuckling and rubbing his hands together and sending out the kind of evil fembot. If you're watching the Marvel films and thinking, I don't think it's Jarvis or Ultron I should be scared of, it's Tony bloody Stark in his Elon Musk. I feel like I should step away from the Elon Musk rant, but you take my point. But these are the scary dudes in these story worlds. That is narrative literacy. That's good story listening. It's how you work out that the real monster in Shelley's Frankenstein, is not the one made out of animal and kind of, human body parts. And with narrative literacy, we get better at listening to those stories about AI that we already have, all 3,000 years worth of them. And this story listening component, this narrative literacy, is an integral part of what UNESCO have been championing. This isn't just me on my soapbox having a little rant about Elon Musk, by the way, although often it is. This is something that UNESCO have been championing in recent years, and they call it futures literacy, which is nice, and it gets them funding. In the same way that AI is the sexy word that gets you funding, futures is another. I've said too much. But futures literacy, I think it's a fascinating model, and they're trying to push governments, policymakers, and sort of big organisations and corporations to take this notion of story listening seriously. They've been championing this move for us to get better at listening to the stories that we already have, but also trying to tell new stories, trying to be more inventive and creative in the stories that we tell about AI, the way that we use stories to think about the future. The future doesn't exist yet. All we've got are the stories and the imaginings and the scenarios that we construct to help us navigate our way through that. And in the same way, for example, that the Better Images of AI project that Bristol is, I'm really proud to have supported, just as the Better Images of AI project is calling for us to rethink the way we use cliched, stereotypical images of AI, UNESCO is proposing that we need better stories about AI futures. I think they're right. You'll have noticed that most of the images I've used, if they're not from the ancient world and they're not from movies, they're from the Better Images of AI playbook. It's awesome. Check it out if you don't know it already. So futures literacy is this skill set. It's a practical skill that can help us, allegedly, just kind of move beyond that utopian, dystopian binary, just move us out of those well-worn grooves of thinking about AI and what the future living with AI might look like. And this is really important if we're going to think through about what measures we need to put in place now to protect us in the future. And that's something that I think governments globally have been really poor at doing. I don't need to tell you that. I think it's just self-evidently true. They also think that we need to be using this story listening, better storytelling, to think about what are the benefits of AI and how do we communicate those to people alongside the kind of big scary stuff. What's the good stuff that might be embedded in their lives? How do we communicate those more effectively and make sure it doesn't get lost among the dystopian kind of horror stories? How do we use stories to, almost like as a safe lab, an imagination lab, to think through the philosophical, ethical questions of AI before we have to deal with, real-world harms and legal cases, frankly. With that in mind, then, I want to put a final thought into your phrenes, into your minds, if I may, and just kind of wrap up with the wisest words of I think, the human who's possibly the most futures literate human I've yet encountered, and that's Fred Pohl, who describes a good science fiction story as something that is acutely futures literate, and it's about predicting not just the tech, not the automobile, but the traffic jam, what happens when the tech hits the socio-tech? How does it interact with people? Another fantastic image from Better Images of AI, and that's where I'm going to stop. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That was fascinating. I hope you were all as inspired by that as I was. One of the thoughts I had when listening to this narrative way of viewing AI, the history of AI, was, well, in data science, we don't have any causality at all. We have data, but there's no causality in data. We put that in with a narrative. We call that a model, but the only way that you get anything that explains anything is through this. And so perhaps it's not so surprising that the only narrative, or the only causal story that we can tell about AI, given that it didn't exist, it is the one that's been told forever. So opening up to questions. Great. Over there first.
That was brilliant. Thank you very much. I was just wondering, I'm thinking about how the likes of Sam Altman and Elon Musk present themselves as like voracious consumers of these narratives. And we see these ironic little gestures in their discourse and in the technologies themselves. And I'm wondering what that does to the narratives. I'm thinking that perhaps there's some formatting going on where they're sort of turned into pastiche and then presented back to us. And I wonder if you agree with that, and I wonder what you think the consequences might be for a futures literacy, how we should think about those when they are kind of fed back to us.
That's such a great question. I have ranted a little bit about Elon Musk, not for the first time, and I'm pretty sure not for the last time. He's a peculiar fellow, right? And Zuckerberg is, I know some of you in the room know his odd characterizations a lot better than me, but they are clearly performing a character in their own kind of, insert your own words of choice. But they are playing a part, and I think there's some really interesting sort of evidence to suggest that Musk is doing this deliberately, performing the Tony Stark character, just as Robert Downey Jr. used some of his readings about Musk. So this really strange recursive trope kind of develops. My fear, my anxiety about this is a dystopian imaginary, so I'm allowed to be fearful here, is that that's for Musk, that's a super kind of highway into the language that we speak about AI. And it sort of garners to him inappropriate levels of authority. So in narratology, we're really interested in four things. Like, we pretend it's complicated, but it's just four things. which we can have as an acronym, TAPO, there will be a test. That's TAPO. T is for tellers, A is for audiences, P is for purposes, and O is for occasion. And the teller, the story is made by the teller. And of course, it's kind of shaped by the audiences. But by sort of channeling into that pre-programming that we have around the lone male, sort of hubristic, autistic creator, then we have this sense in which he's like I said, just channeling it into all that backstory that we have. And he has unnecessary and amplified authority because of it as a teller. So who is not telling the stories? One of the questions that I'm doing something at the Cheltenham Science Festival on Sunday. One of the questions that we're asking is, whose AI imaginary are we living in, and whose AI imaginary do we want to be living in? We don't want to be living in Musk's. So how do we get other people's voices to contribute to that? And he's such great clickbait. We saw from the reports. Yeah, I could talk about this for far too long, sorry, but it's a really great question, and it should trouble us. But he's very good at manipulating that narrative. I really will be quiet now, sorry.
Great. Yeah, go ahead.
My sort of impression of Athens was that they were pessimistic when sober. And it seems to me that they were telling themselves stories, partly to distract themselves from the problems they had, partly to think that somebody else has got even worse problems, and maybe as a way of thinking that they've got better, that things might get better. And maybe one of my concerns is that the focus on AI is also distracting us from sorting out proper problems like we can't build houses, demographics, climate change.
Yes, I got a really quick answer to you, not because it's not an awesome question. Yes, you're so right. This AI is shiny. It's the clickbait. It's the golden, think back to those ancient Greeks. It's the shiny gold and silver stories. And what the narratives around, particularly embodied AI and the kind of super sentient, tend to obscure is the sort of the materiality of AI, the water that goes into cooling kind of server farms, the kind of the minerals that need to go into this. I hope I had a block of silicon as on one of my illustrations. The materiality of AI is something that gets lost from these narratives all too easily. What's the latest stats on how much water every ChatGPT search uses? It is terrifying. When we're hearing stories about sort of AI afterlives and sort of death bots, which is disturbing for all kinds of reasons. But when we have to make a decision in the coming years, let's be clear, we're not talking decades or centuries anymore about who gets water and who gets, precious energy resources. Is it going to be keeping, that sort of dead bot alive? Is it going to be keeping, the cooling for the farmer, server farm, or is it to go to actual farms to feed people? So I absolutely think it is distracting us from those critical questions. Absolutely. I don't know how to, with more emphasis. Yes, you are so right. And that should really concern us. It distracts us from another real-world dystopia that we're walking through. Another quotation which I again didn't make the final cut is, future thinking is important. It's really critical as a skill set for the 21st century. But the future's already here, right? It's just not. It's a Arthur Clarke. It's just not equally distributed, and so many of these stories are distracting us from those social inequities. What you said.
Great. This question here. Microphone's just coming.
Many of our stories about AI are also examinations of the human condition, with the AI used as an allegory for how humanity behaves. How do we disentangle the representation of the AI and how the author is trying to discuss the human condition in the same story?
Lovely. Again, so these are very good. I'm just going to put a quick, can we also have some women asking some questions as well? That's awesome. I don't know is the really honest answer. I don't know, because it's a gnarly question. Because in story, just as a story needs event, a story needs character, and it needs human characters or anthropomorphic character. This is, think of WALL-E, we have no sound, we have but we anthropomorphize it. It's what we do. Again, this I will accept as part of the adapted kind of part of the brain that's evolved as part of storytelling animals. I don't know how we disentangle that imbrication. I really don't have a good answer. I have a hunch that I think TV does this better than novels or film. It's certainly better than classical myth. Where you have long-form storytelling, you can firstly be quite nuanced in the way that you approach it. You can have distributed kind of AI. I mean, these aren't terribly good examples, but person of interest and things like that are quite good at teasing out. I mean, they're all very, very sort of, kind of human focused. I also want to, this is not going to go down anyway, no one's going to do this, but we need more sort of boring stories about AI that aren't dramatic, that aren't dystopian. I don't know what they look like. I'm not sure I want to sit through them either. But what are the boring stories? And I think that might move around, but we're not programmed for boring stories. So I don't know what they look like. It's critical that we get better at doing this, but I don't have the answers.
Hiya.
Thank you.
You mentioned that you got into the AI field due to your interest in kind of fembots, sexbots, and I have to say that's a real concern of mine in terms of how it's going to take us back years when it comes to equality. And it is generally men who are creating AI systems, whether it's autonomous beings or something that's more distant. What are your thoughts on how we can prevent that from happening and ensure that fembots and sexbots don't hold us back as women?
Excellent. This is so nice. Thank you. I said earlier that the best things about doing these sort of public events is the questions. This is what, I just kind of flum around on here for a bit. These questions are so fantastic, and really kind of things that we will all think about until next Data Week. This is gorgeous. You've really kind of identified a kind of really critical issue, which at the moment I don't do anything more than just worry about. There's a reason why I don't work on that anymore. Just found it really unhealthy, unethical, and I'm not just inflecting my voice like that. I'm genuinely struggling to find the right words with it, but it just doesn't sit well. It is damaging. I think that's really. I wouldn't go quite so far as I've forgotten the name of the woman who has the no sex bots. Kathleen, I've forgotten her name, I'm so sorry, that's really rude. But there are amazing, amazing women in this space. Kate Devlin's one of them, who's much more, sort of proactive around celebrating the potentials of this. I think we need to work really hard to make sure, it goes back to that futures literacy debate a little bit. We need everyone to have a voice. We need to not just have a few individual, sort of Muskites, having the platform, I feel bad having the platform, but having the voice, being the tellers, talking to us as the audience. We need many more voices, many more points of views like yours. We just need to put our hands up and ask those questions. And we need to lean on projects like the Better Images of AI project out of Bristol, and not have, I've been guilty of this. I have images of Ava from Ex Machina all over my slides because it's pretty, right? But really trying hard not to do that and not to lean into those kind of lazy stereotypes. We all know better, and I think we just kind of keep banging on about it. But just to circle back to that brilliant question about, is that distracting us from the real world harms? Yes, I think a lot of the AI debate is distracting us from the real world harms that are being done to mental health and to perceptions of women, and sort of incel increases globally, and misogyny as part of this bigger narrative world. I've gone dark and dystopian really quickly. I'm so sorry, but it's absolutely critical, and thank you for raising it.
I guess those of us with the platform, we need to do what we can to encourage everybody to engage in the discussion in the future. we can't necessarily have equality of people doing the engineering of these things in the short term. We can definitely raise the equality of people engaged in the discussion. The next question was towards the back.
You told a really compelling story about the paucity of the narrative imagination in this particular domain and the kind of domain of human-machine interaction, I guess, from antiquity up to the present day. And I found myself wondering whether there's something unique about this particular domain, or whether actually you see other areas where you think there's a similar kind of paucity of the narrative imagination that maybe has its roots in antiquity, and whether there's anything that we can learn from those other areas of narrative that perhaps might be, where there might be greater futures literacy or, yeah.
Oh, see, that's so nice. Again, sorry, I think the bar has been set and then someone just kind of pushes it up. That's gorgeous. This isn't my specialist area, but I know that colleagues are doing some fantastic work around thinking about, we're back to the environmental kind of concern around, about sort of apocalyptic narratives, end of the world narratives, and these were really prominent in the ancient world as well, and develop into, sort of quasi-respectable religions. I'm conscious there are classicists in the room, and Stoicism is not my thing, but the idea, telling stories about, the world being destroyed in a cosmic conflagration as being a really, sort of important part of the kind of philosophical, kind of ethical tradition of, huge swathes of ancient empire. Thinking through catastrophe, thinking through resilience, thinking through how we sort of prepare ourselves to deal with those sort of culture-destroying moments. That's something I think the ancient world is really good. Greek tragedy has an enduring legacy for a reason. And very often those stories are emerging from real-world, traumas, wars, exodus, genocides, really dreadful stories, as well as kind of loss of environment. And I think that might be something that I know some colleagues are working on there, particularly around sort of eco-criticism and trying to kind of find out what lessons we can learn from that long history of futures is the way I kind of picture it. So I work in futures and emerging technologies, but I always like to take the long view because we're very often told, like, this is shiny, this has never happened. When we were going through the pandemic, I mean, how many times did we hear, this is unprecedented? And no, it's not. It's really not. This is unpredictable. No, it was predicted. We were overdue on those sorts of things. Just take a slightly longer view. And, I'm not just saying there's nothing new under the sun, but we tend to repeat. History repeats itself a lot. And I think they're absolutely interesting ways that we can learn from that. So I think the kind of eco-critical one would be, for me, the most significant. I've been doing some work recently. I'm just kind of scanning my brain to think of it. So UNDP are doing some work around trauma. How does society recover from trauma, and not just kind of pass that on to future generations? And story is obviously one of the the most kind of transportable, not saying it's the most potent, but it's one of the most kind of sort of transportable ways of trying to negotiate that. So there are, sort of intergovernmental agencies trying to do this in real world contexts this evening. But it's a fantastic question.
Great. Time for maybe one last question. There were 2 hands up. 3 now. Go ahead.
Hello, that was brilliant, thank you. I know everyone else has said that, but it's true. So, what does story tell us about how we can, I can't think of another word than transcend the paradigm, for which I apologise.
That's a T-shirt right there, that's really nice.
So we have these are the tropes, these are the sort of, they could become concretized. Do we have any examples from story about people doing things differently and moving past that, what they've been given?
Yes, that's really nice. I try not to say this too much, so a public forum is the right place to confess to it. I'm a bit of a geek for the Russian formalists. They're really not popular and they're not as sexy, and they're very hard to read. But they kind of invented contemporary narratology, and I like going back to the source. Obviously, Aristotle was there first. I know the classicists will say Aristotle's first, but the formalists kind of rediscovered Aristotle and established the principles of contemporary narratology. So I think Vladimir Prop was, and the morphology of the folktale emerges from that Russian tradition. And within that, what they sort of define as the kind of spark of creativity in narrative is estrangement, ostrani. So you get the story of, well, we saw it with Frankenstein getting retold as Short Circuit. We saw Pandora get retold as Megan, that realistic. Don't watch that; it's horrible. And Ex Machina as a new kind of Ava, and that's replication, that's repetition. And so for Shklovsky and the formalists, good storytelling, this probably goes back to narrative literacy as well, and I just hadn't made that connection, so thank you very much. It's about a kind of swerve, it's about a variation, it's about estrangement. So you go in thinking, yeah, I know what this story's about, I know what that character's going to do, and then it's, oh, I didn't see that coming up, which we love when we're watching a film or TV or reading it. It's like, oh, I didn't see, oh, you clever bastard, you. That's what we really get a lovely little dopamine hit when that happens. And I think that's what we need to be doing more of in our collective storytelling. And I'd love to see more of that, not just sort of reissuing those tropes. A good example would be The Creator. Did that come out last year, the year before? Which is great. Oh, I can't do this without spoiler. I'm really sorry. Watch The Creator if you have a couple of hours to spare. It's very, very good, except it could be better. So it kind of reverses some of the, I can't say more without spoiling it for people, and you should watch it, it's worth watching. But yeah, I just think not just reversing those standard patterns and tropes, which is the really thing to do, but kind of swerving and just stranging them. That would be my suggestion. And Shklovsky, the formalist who really kind of embeds that in narratology, looks back to, sorry, I'm such a geek, looks back to Ovid as his example. He looks back to the classics as someone who does this very well. So that. There are many reasons why I love Shklovsky, but that's just one of them. You didn't need to know that, but I'll just throw that in there.
Wow. This has been really inspiring. Thank you so much. And yes, let's thank Genevieve.
Thank you, Dan.